All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty interesting. It's this question. What's next for Yunus? Do you think his social business model can change capitalism?
Hmm.
And, it's interesting that the listener didn't give us a whole lot of background here. It's almost like they're assuming that we all know who Yunus is and what his deal is.
Right.
But maybe not everybody's totally familiar with this work. So why don't we start there for the benefit of anyone listening who's not totally sure who he is or what he does?
Sure, yeah. Mohammed Yunus, I think it's safe to say he's a real pioneer in the world of microfinance.
Yeah.
He founded the Grameen Bank, and he actually ended up winning a Nobel Peace Prize for his work in fighting poverty.
Oh, yeah.
And his whole social business model, it kind of stems from that microfinance background.
Okay.
The idea is that businesses should focus on tackling these social or environmental problems that we're facing, and then any profits that they make get reinvested back into that mission.
So it's not all about just making as much money as possible.
Right, exactly. It's not your typical profit-driven model. It's more about using business as a force for good.
I like that. A force for good.
Yeah.
So you said the profits get reinvested back into the mission.
Yeah.
But how does that actually work? I mean, what are the nuts and bolts of it? How do you make sure that the profits are actually being used to further that social cause?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's more involved than just taking all the profits and dumping them into some random charity.
Yeah.
It takes careful planning and a lot of transparency.
Hmm.
Like a social business might decide, okay, we're going to allocate, say, 20% of our profits to initiatives that directly address the problem we're trying to solve.
Okay.
So for instance, let's say you have a company that's focused on providing clean water access. They might take those profits and use them to build wells in communities that don't have reliable water sources.
That makes sense.
And another really important thing is that they track their impact very carefully. They're measuring things like how many people they've been able to help or how much of an environmental improvement they've made.
So there's like a built-in accountability system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I like that.
You have to be able to show that you're actually making a difference.
Right. So our listener's question goes even further than that, though. They're asking if this model can actually change capitalism itself, like really disrupt the system as we know it.
Right.
So what aspects of capitalism do you think could be impacted if Yunus's ideas really started to catch on and become more widespread?
That's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
But just imagine for a second, what if businesses were actually legally obligated to prioritize a social mission alongside making a profit?
Oh.
That could completely change the way companies operate and how they measure their success.
Yeah.
Instead of just focusing on shareholder value, it would be about the well-being of employees,
Yeah.
the health of communities, and the environment.
It's a whole different mindset. Totally. And think about what that could mean for industries like fast fashion or fossil fuels industries that get a lot of criticism for their impact on people and the planet.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. But wouldn't there be a lot of pushback? I mean, wouldn't a lot of people resist that kind of change?
Oh, absolutely. There would be. Some people would say that it's just not realistic to expect all businesses to adopt a social mission. They'd argue that competition and the free market naturally prioritize profit above all else.
Right.
And others might worry that it would create an unfair advantage for some companies over others, especially small businesses or companies that operate in really competitive markets. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of scaling up this model globally. I mean, that would be a huge undertaking. It would require a massive shift, not just in how businesses operate, but also in government regulations and consumer behavior.
So it's so many moving parts.
Exactly. Wouldn't be easy.
I'm just thinking, you mentioned earlier that Yunus's work comes out of his experience with microfinance, and that got me wondering if there are any historical parallels that we can look to. Have there been other movements that seemed really radical at first, but then eventually became more mainstream over time? Are there any examples that could give us some insight into how this social business model might evolve?
Yeah, that's a good point. One example that comes to mind is the organic food movement.
Okay.
Back in the day, it was a niche market, and a lot of people saw it as being more expensive and less convenient than conventional food.
Right.
But over time, people became more aware of the benefits, and they started demanding organic options, and businesses responded to that demand. And now you can find organic food pretty much everywhere.
That's true.
And another interesting example is the fair trade movement, which focuses on ethical sourcing and worker rights. So these movements show us that when consumers become more conscious of the impact of their choices, it can actually influence the way businesses operate and even reshape entire industries.
That's really hopeful.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful.
So if Yunus's model follows a similar path, what do you think he's focusing on right now? What's next for him in terms of refining and expanding this approach?
Well, he's always been someone who's thinking ahead, pushing the boundaries.
Yeah.
So I imagine he's probably exploring ways to make the social business model even more robust and adaptable.
Okay.
Like one thing he might be working on is developing standardized metrics for measuring social impact.
Right.
If you can measure it, you can manage it, right?
Exactly.
And if we can easily compare the impact of different social businesses, that would make it easier for investors and consumers to make informed decisions.
That makes sense.
And I wouldn't be surprised if he's also looking into how technology can play a role. Things like using blockchain for supply chain transparency or AI to optimize resource allocation to maximize the social benefit.
It's amazing to think about what technology can do.
I know, it's really exciting.
And as we're facing all these global challenges like climate change and inequality, I bet Yunus sees his model as being more relevant than ever.
Oh, absolutely. I think he sees it as a potential solution, a way to create a more just and sustainable world.
So to bring it back to our listener who asked that initial question, what's next for Yunus?
Right.
It seems like his social business model could offer a roadmap for a future where doing business and doing good are one and the same.
Exactly.
And while there are definitely challenges and obstacles along the way, his work really encourages us to rethink our assumptions about capitalism and the role that business plays in society.
Yeah, and I think the biggest takeaway here is that this isn't just about Yunus, this is about all of us. As investors, consumers, citizens, we all have a part to play in shaping the kind of world we want to live in.
So to leave everyone listening with something to think about, let's say that businesses were actually legally obligated to prioritize a social mission. What industries do you think would be most transformed, and what kinds of unexpected consequences, both good and bad, might we see as a result of that kind of fundamental shift?
Wow, that's a big one.
Yeah, it's something to ponder.
Definitely.
So keep exploring those questions, and until next time, happy deep diving.
Thanks for having me.
It was great talking to you.